Hi there, and welcome to the very first episode of the Social Network Society podcast. The Social Network Society is a community aimed to foster meaningful connections among the scholars engaged in research, teaching, and practice of social networks.
In this podcast series, we will spotlight recently published peer-reviewed articles, introduce the brilliant minds behind the articles, and uncover more about the fascinating world of social networks through the lens of authors.
This podcast is brought to you by the Social Network Society communications team. Your hosts today are Tomova Shakur, an assistant professor in the Management and Leadership Department at Texas Christian University.
And Danny Yan, assistant professor in the Management and Organization Department at Penn State University.
Today, we have the privilege of speaking with the authorship team of a recently published paper in organization science titled The Reconnection Process, Mobilizing the Social Capital of Dormant Ties.
This groundbreaking work explores dormant ties, which are defined as former ties that are now out of touch that can be rekindled and made active again. Although prior work has conceptualized dormant ties as ties that can be easily rekindled, this paper offers a counterintuitive finding. Individuals can and do bundle their attempts to reconnect with dormant ties, ultimately preventing the mobilization of social capital. Using an impressive set of research studies, this research finds that for a tie to be activated, individuals need to remember the past to catch up on missed time and to perceive the tie similarly.
To help us uncover the journey of this paper, we're joined by two of its authors, Dr. Emanuela Rondi, who is a professor at the University of Bergamo, and Dr. Daniel Levin, who's a professor at Rutgers University. Hi, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first guest. We're really excited to chat with you.
Thank you for inviting us. It's flattering to be asked for this, the inaugural podcast of SNS.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Let's start by unraveling a bit about your own journey. How did you get into the profession?
Emanuela, you want to go first?
Yes, so for me, the passion about networks, social networks, came from my master studies. I graduated as a management engineer, and during this course, I studied a lot about innovation and the importance of relationships in innovation. And in Italy, we have multiple industrial districts, so places where different companies get together into the same industry, and they collaborate in order to develop an ecosystem for innovation and business development. So here I understood the importance of social networks and relationships across organization to spur innovation.
So for me, I started out after college working in a general management consulting firm, and I got interested in organizations. I mean, I've been interested for a long time, and but I was curious about why things are the way they are, and so I decided to go into academia to explore that.
And what sparked your research interest in social networks and related topics?
So for me, I kind of backed into being interested in networks. I resisted it for a long time. I'm interested in knowledge transfer, knowledge sharing, interested in the underlying mechanisms that got more and more micro over the years. And um, I guess maybe I had this idea for my dissertation, which I didn't publish, but I couldn't figure out how to test it. And then I heard Rob Cross, when I was a junior professor and he was a PhD student, present at the Academy of Management about some networks related technique. And I'm like, ooh, I could use that idea to test that method to test my idea. And I talked to him about it and we collaborated on that project. And I guess that got me interested in networks. But I really studied like the mechanism, the micro mechanisms of networks.
Mhm. Let's get to the nitty-gritty of the paper. What inspired you to study how people reconnect with dormant ties?
Okay, so maybe I'll take the first part of this, and then Manuela, you'll pick up the story. So, I first thought of the idea about dormant ties, it actually came about as a result of a call for papers for a special issue of Academy Management Review, which was on repairing relationships. And anytime I see one of these call for papers, maybe you do the same thing, I'm thinking, do I have anything that I could plausibly put under that I could submit to this issue? And I didn't. And then I started to get kind of annoyed. I thought, like, how come they get a whole issue just on repairing relationships? And I thought, for my own life, like, how many relationships have I had which have been so damaged that they needed to be repaired? Like, I don't know, maybe a handful? And I thought, well, how many people have I lost touch with over the years? Not because there was any falling out, but because people switch jobs or move away. I thought must be hundreds, but we don't really know anything or hardly anything about those ties. Um, so then I thought, oh, this paper, I just finished this paper with Rob Cross on trusted weak ties. So the benefits of getting information or advice from people you don't know very well, but for whatever reason you still trust. And I thought, oh, reconnected ties, dormant ties, especially if they used to be strong, there might still be some residual goodwill there. They might be kind of like those um, trusted weak ties if you could reconnect them. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. Um, but it's so like, how often do people reconnect just spontaneously? It's going to be pretty rare. Like, how am I going to catch them doing that? Like, I could survey them, but like, did they do it in the last few days? If not, like, it's never gonna, it seemed impossible. And I thought, I have to have some sort of intervention. I'll have to like ask people to reconnect. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I can't go to a company and say, tell all your employees to reconnect to people they've lost touch with. I thought, well, maybe I could do that in an MBA class. But then I thought, well, the people when an MBA student, what are they like? Somewhere from like early 20s to late 20s, like the people they've lost touch with are not necessarily in their industry or their field, so it might not be that useful. So that I really need executive MBAs who are maybe like early 30s and older. Um, so the Rutgers EMBA Executive MBA program is a little on the small side relative to the sample size I would need. So I thought, oh, let me contact someone from Kellogg where I got my PhD. They have a large EMBA program. Person I contacted said, oh, you want to talk to Keith Murnion, who's not somebody I didn't know him well and I hadn't talked to him in a number of years. Um, and we'd never collaborated before. But he taught the organization behavior class, which had a lot of students where this might be relevant. And I explained the idea to him. I want to have an assignment where they have to reconnect, and then we'll survey them afterwards and say how useful was it. And it took me about a minute to describe it, and he said, "Yeah, let's do it." I'm like, you're gonna have to like completely change your class and the assignments. He's like, "Yeah, I'm on board." So that was really the first reconnected dormant ties of that project. And ultimately, we surveyed several hundred people over time. Another co-author of mine, Jorga Walter, I brought into the paper, and he was really helpful with it as well. I've collaborated on a number of dormant ties projects, but the basic idea was the previous school of thought was dormant ties are dead. The social capital is gone. If you don't maintain that social capital, it withers and dies. And what we found is, no, it's still there. And it can be reconnected. And we said, oh, look how easy it is, maybe naively, to reconnect. We'll get to that when we get to this paper. And so that's sort of how I got into dormant ties. Okay,
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. So it came out from a place of pettiness and resentment about a special issue that I wasn't eligible for. Yeah. Go ahead, Emanuela. Do you want to say what happened from your end then?
Yeah, on my side, I just started the PhD and I was so much into this process theory and Langley perspective of how organization evolve and the dynamics. And then at the same time, I started reading more about social networks. My PhD supervisor were Alfredo De Massis and Sarah Jack, and she at the point she was very much into networks relationships. And I was like, okay, but this literature looks so much about how many contacts you have in your network and whether these ties are strong or weak, but they don't really observe how the network types evolve dynamically. So I was like, okay, but what is the aspects that relates most to the dynamics of networks? And at that point, I started reading the studies by Daniel Levin. And there I realized that reconnection in dormant ties in general was something that I wanted to focus more on. But I strongly disagreed about the easiness of Dormant reconnection, because on my side, maybe I'm shy about cold calls, but calling someone from scratch to ask for something to me sounds quite difficult. And so I realized that that would be the case also for other people in organizations when they need something for developing their projects, and maybe they don't have the courage to call them. So I wanted to investigate the processes in Dormant reconnection.
Yeah, I definitely think it's really hard to reconnect dormant eyes. And reading your paper, now I feel a little bit more confident doing it.
Yeah.
Danny?
Emanuela, do you want to tell the story about how we met, how our paths converged?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
so
that's interesting.
that would be, this was a very nice story. So basically, I was at the AOM conference and presenting another paper that was still about social capital mobilization and dynamics in network that I've never published, by the way. And Daniel was in the audience, and he asked so many intriguing questions about the study. And at the end, he came to me and he asked for the explanation. And then I realized from his tag that he was that Daniel Levin. And I was like, oh, okay. So, Professor, I would like to discuss with you about another project that I'm working on, which is exactly tackling the topic of dormant ties. And at the end, he was kind enough to spend with me 2 hours of his time at the AOM conference. And I had the chance to present my paper that at that stage was a really developmental one. But well, Daniel, do you want to move on with the
Oh, I'll
nice
tell you what
discussion
my
we had?
what my experience of our meeting was. So I remember I typically at Academy I'll set aside an hour to to meet with someone. And so I said, oh, let's talk an hour, but it was going so well, and I was so impressed with the data she collected that we ended up spending 2 hours talking about it. But it was fairly far along. This was just the qualitative interviews and observations that she had done, and honestly, I thought going into this that it was impossible to collect data on reconnections as they happen. But Emanuela figured out how to do it, which was she went to industry conventions and she followed people around and she watched it happen and she took notes and audio recorded. She also had a lot of interviews with people in the industry about their reconnections when other people reached out to them or when they did the reaching out. But it was those observations that like, wow, I never thought of doing that. That is, I thought it was impossible. I had surveyed people right before and right after reconnection. I had these ideas. Maybe I could like put them in like a laboratory and bring people together who used to know each other. But how am I going to coordinate that? And it's going to be stilted and awkward. And anyway, I was really quite taken with it, and I thought this is really cool. Um, but the model, the qualitative research, I'm not a qualitative research really. I've done it a little, not well. Um, but it was very complex and nuanced and descriptive. And Emanuela is smiling a little bit because she knows what I'm going to say, which was she had this model, and I kind of hated it. It was sort of a double helix. I called it a tornado. Can I share it real quick,
Yes.
Emanuela? That's okay.
My
Um,
amazing tornado model.
she still loves it. Um, anyway, it was complicated and things waving and moving around and very detailed. And the other thing was that it was very cool, but it was overwhelming for me as a potential reader. And also, it covered the entire life cycle of a tie from tie formation, maintenance, decay, dormancy, reconnection, possibly decay again. It was just a really big scope. It was just too much to take on. And some of that had already been covered in the literature. There's a lot of stuff on tie formation. Um, and I thought the key here, the most interesting part is that middle phase of the moment of reconnection that was a little bit of a black box for me, and I thought in the literature also. Anyway, so I said, what I don't remember exactly what I said, but something like I hate this tornado, but I love the project. And some of the ideas that she had discovered on like what makes it more successful, I thought were really cool. But I think it was either about to be or was already under review at AMJ. So like my feedback was basically useless. I said, well, listen, if that doesn't work out, I'm happy to help more, be involved. I think either then or subsequently, I had ideas that it could really benefit from maybe an experiment or some other data collection to verify, to replicate what was coming out of the qualitative. I thought that would be a nice combination. It turns out later that next year, so I followed up. We had a little email exchange in the fall, and then the following spring, we got roped into doing a proposal for a Journal of Management special issue, not special issue, literature review on network brokerage. So we worked together for a couple of months intensively in May and June on that of the following year. And then after that, I think I followed up and said, hey, what about that Dormant ties thing? Are you still interested in that? And she sent me the rejection letter from AMJ, and I said, okay, let's talk about it. And then we refined the ideas, I think, back and forth on the qualitative side, and then also eventually designed an experiment to replicate those ideas. So anyway, that's how we ended up coming together. It was basically through AOM.
Super interesting. And Danny now has some questions about the research design.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing the research process and how you get together. I think that's the beauty of AOM and like networking, right? And the serendipity. So I think that's super helpful. So I have some questions about the challenges that you faced during your research. So Daniel, you talked about how the qualitative research can be kind of a messy, but also rich, right? So for what were the specific like obstacles that you encountered during data collection, analysis, or conceptualization that stood out to you? And how did you kind of get together, overcome those obstacles? I think those advice will be super helpful for researchers.
Thanks a lot for the question. At the beginning, I spent a lot of time understanding how the research design for the qualitative part could work. And I started from the interviews. So I went to people asking how did they reconnected when they were in a situation of innovation projects and they had to reach out someone that they have not been in touch for a while. This data collection was conducted in the textile industry, especially close to the fashion industry. So there are fashion waves. So people that are relevant for a period of time, then maybe they suspend the connection when that type of fabric or pattern is not in fashion. And then this relationship need to get revamped afterwards in the next wave of the fashion. So I thought that by interviewing people, I could get a clear understanding about how they reconnected. So I went there asking many questions and with a semi-structured interview protocol. And I realized that explaining retrospectively how they reconnected was very much formalized and suffered from a little bit of retrospective bias, because they were able to explain how the reconnection was successful, but at the same time, they missed the emotional elements related to that, and also how they developed the process of the different elements. So at that point, I was a little bit surprised about the fact that I was not able to collect close data to the process, but at the same time, I realized that I needed to corroborate this evidence with the observations. And so I was like, okay, but where can I find observations about reconnection? And at that point, there were some exhibitions going around in the field. So I was invited to join, and actually I joined this exhibition in order to get access to further interviews. So to know people and get their contact in order to interview them. And while I was there, I observed the reconnection. And I was like a click, okay, so I'm in the right place. This is the place where I can get the observation I need in order to understand how the reconnection actually works. Then I can compile these observations with the interviews, but my primary data will be the observation itself. So I started attending any type of exhibition that it was in the field and traveling around the country in order to observe as many exhibitions as I could in the industry. I was lucky enough that there was a global exhibition that took place in Milan that year. And this is an exhibition that changes always the country. So that was another point of observation for myself. So how I came through the obstacle of not getting enough data on what I wanted was to create a broader methodology for collecting the data that would be relevant for my study.
Right. Yeah.
I was going to say the key conceptual. So that was early on, right before I was involved, which is what I think is so impressive about the qualitative research that Emanuela did. The conceptual obstacle that I confront, that she and I together were confronting, was that how do we make this interesting, and not just descriptive in a way that's like, okay, that's how it is. And I think the key for us was coming up with noticing and emphasizing the failures. People tried to reconnect, but they bungled it. It just didn't go well. And this was partly surprising because I had previously published that it's fairly easy to reconnect. Not that people are, just to clarify from before, not that people are super willing to do it, right? We noticed a lot of anxiety about it. We called it reconnection anxiety, where people are nervous, but then in the end, it works out fine, we thought. And what are you nervous about? It's going to be, people love it in the end, but getting over that initial hump. Well, it turns out from Manuela's data, there's something to be nervous about because people can and do screw it up. So I was encouraging Emanuela, go back to the data, find everything, every failure, every time where somebody tried something. And she had these amazing examples where somebody is walking away from a reconnection attempt and turns to her and says, "Can you believe that guy? I am never talking to him again." And we're like, wow, like what went wrong? And then, so maybe this is the quantitative hypothesis testing mindset that I come with, was like, okay, well, what made it successful and what made it a failure? What were the elements? And that's sort of how we started pushing a little bit more on that aspect. And that, I think, to me, that's what makes the thing interesting, because then you can, and practical too. It's like, okay, do these things and you're more likely to be successful. We already knew that from previous research that reconnecting is something that provides a lot of value, but we didn't necessarily know how you should go about it. Now we know a lot more about that from this research.
Super, absolutely. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the revision process? So you mentioned that the paper was previously rejected from AMJ. Then was organization science the next logical step for you guys, or did you go to another outlet?
Oh, it's a string of rejections. Do you want to talk about it, Emanuela?
It's a 10-year story of rejection.
Oh my God. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well,
but that's very inspirational because all of
not
us.
all 10 years were rejection, but the last few maybe.
Yeah, the paper was submitted to AMJ in the first version, so qualitative data only. Then when Daniel joined, we collected further data. We reframed fully the theoretical perspective to make it broader. And we didn't talk anymore only about dormant ties, but we focus it on social capital mobilization. So a broader perspective to tackle also.
Well, hold on just one second, Melanie, just to clarify. We
Yeah.
narrowed the scope to just be about the reconnection moment, that reconnection process empirically, and then we added an experiment to replicate that. But then when we were trying to frame the paper theoretically, conceptually, we thought dormant ties is too narrow. No one's going to buy this. We better make this a bigger story. And so that's when we said, oh, let's frame it as social capital mobilization. In general. Okay. So Emanuela, you keep going. Wait.
No, thanks a lot, because this also explains the reason why we could then resubmit to AMJ, because we added different aspects that were necessary in order to resubmit to the same journal. But still, it was a second rejection from the same journal. So we then decided to submit to Administrative Science Quarterly, because we really wanted to engage with this conversation on social capital mobilization and this element of social networks and implications for the mobilization of resources through the Dormant reconnection perspective. But this was a second journal rejection, so like the third now. And at the end, we decided to submit to organization science, and to do so, we found the right audience.
That's great. I'm glad that you found such a great home for the paper. And I think it's very inspirational to talk about the losses too, because all of us hit a wall all the time at, top tier journals. And it's important to remember not to give up and to keep improving the work.
Yeah. I mean, but you have to believe in the paper a little bit. I've gotten rejections from top journals where I said, yeah, they're right. This stinks. We should abandon this project or completely reframe it. But here and in other experiences I've had, I think we said, like, we lost a year, like from when we had the two study paper to when it finally submitted it to Org Science, from the other two rejections. And honestly, I was looking at it the other day. We didn't change that much. We're still framing it as this is a cool example of how social capital can be mobilized, how you can access the resources in your network, but we're trying to say that it's a broader example. And they kept saying, not really. It's not really. And then the kicker is Org Science. They also said, yeah, not really. Just make it about dormant ties, but with an R&R. So then we're like, oh, okay, you're actually interested in a paper that we can frame as a paper being about dormant ties. Perfect. We thought we needed that social capital mobilization general story to get our foot in the door. Maybe we did at Org Science. It didn't work at the other two. But then once we did that, then that got us forward. We still, yeah.
That's great. Do you mind me asking how many rounds?
Do you remember, Emanuela?
I think 3 plus conditional acceptance 4.
Really? That many?
Yeah.
Huh. I blocked those out. Okay.
Do you remember any particular comment that you received from the review team that you were struggling to address or end up not addressing?
I think the big one, which is what we mentioned, which was making it about dormant ties from the beginning. Not just that's an example of a bigger story, but say, like, no, let's talk about the reconnection moment. And the way to do that, to make it interesting, was to trash is too strong a word, to critique my earlier work, which said, oh, this is super easy to reconnect. There's nothing to worry about. Just go ahead and do it. And we say, like, well, actually, people can and do screw it up, and here's how to do it more successfully, and here's the elements of a successful reconnection. And once we could frame it like that, which we were able to do in the resubmission to Org Science, that's where we started to make a lot more progress, I think.
That's great. And were you struggling with convincing reviewers of the merits of qualitative data? Or did you get reviewers that appreciate the method?
No, actually, no, because when we submitted it to Org Science, we already have the mixed research design.
Okay.
So we were able to compensate the qualitative part with the experiment, so the quantitative data. Still, we received a lot of questions about the methodology. So we had to justify many of the aspects that related to the research design for the qualitative part.
But they were not fundamentally skeptical of the qualitative approach, I think in part because we had the experiment. And I think if we had just submitted one, I'm not sure if it would have been accepted. And if we had just submitted the experiment, I'm pretty sure that would have been rejected on its own also. But the combination of the two seemed much more persuasive and compelling.
Do you have any practical advice for researchers who want to use mixed methods?
I was in an academy session this past year and I noticed there were maybe 5 papers presented and they all had, oh, these are a network session, and they all had an experiment attached to it, right? It was a survey or a qualitative or archival with a little experiment to check for cause and effect or something, right? To validate the ideas. I think it's a I thought about my own research the last 10 years. I think almost every paper I published has had a little something in there. It's not maybe all experiments. I think it's really helpful. I mean, with networks research, you can't randomly assign someone to have certain ties, right? You can't say like, okay, be friends with this person for the next 5 years, and let's, like, so you can't tease apart cause and effect so easily, but you can at least try to get at some of the mechanisms. Um, it can be helpful. So I think I want to do that with whenever appropriate with lots of studies. And the other key is to have co-authors or people who can advise you on how to do a method. I could never have done the qualitative stuff that Emanuela was doing. I learned about axial coding and all sorts of technical things I don't 100% understand, but I'm impressed by. Um, and she was unfamiliar with doing experiments. I was kind of new to it too. There's a fellow in my department, Alex Van Zandt, who's a whiz at this stuff, and he advised us on how to structure the vignette that we did. So I think either finding a co-author who's good at this stuff or somebody who can be helpful, I think is key, and having a good co-author who can do the different methods.
When reading the paper, I had a recurring question about whether there are any differences between men and women, as to whether men or women are better at rekindling dormant ties, whether there are differences between maybe racial and ethnic minorities versus majorities and their ability to rekindle dormant ties. Do you have any insights on that? And is that possibly maybe a future direction that you would want to take this work?
It's a very interesting element that we kind of scratched the surface about in our study, but we didn't have enough element to go deeper into that. This is because, especially for the qualitative data collection, the industry was male dominated, and it was very much culturally grounded in the Italian culture. We try to compensate a little bit for that with the experiment, but it was not possible for us to take into account all these nuances. But for sure, these are interesting aspects that can be future research direction to explore what are the individual characteristics that shape the dormant ties reconnection process, whether there are individuals that for their characteristics are more equipped or better suited to reconnect in terms of gender, in terms of cultural background, in terms also of personality traits. That's another element that could be interesting investigating.
I think if anyone's listening to this podcast and would like to do that as future research, I think that would be great. I think we don't really know in terms of the value people get from reconnecting, how that would vary by gender, by race, by nationality, other things. And then also the willingness to reach out in the first place, and the anxieties people feel about that. We also don't know how that might vary by individual differences. Maybe personality differences. Maybe self-monitors are high self-monitors are better at this than others, or people who are extroverted. There's a whole host of moderators that we don't know yet.
Those are very exciting research directions that our listeners and the community members can take. Thanks for sharing. So, how have your research findings changed your approach to networking personally, or how you study networking?
So on my side, as I mentioned at the beginning, the reason why I started this project was because I felt anxious about reconnection, and now having clear what I have to do, let's say following these three elements and always reflecting about what can I do better in terms of reminiscing or catching up. Am I going too much into the intimacy of our relationship? What is the perception that I have about this relationship, and what can be the perception that the others have, and so relate and adopt a consistent behavior, helped me a lot in not being constrained in reconnecting. It's like maybe I wouldn't have started that reconnection before, but now that I know and I'm equipped about interesting tools to use, I feel better in the reconnection process.
For me, in terms of how it's changed research or the impact on research, one of the things that we did that I'm pretty excited about that we did after we got accepted at Organization Science is we created a practitioner-oriented companion piece, which got published in MIT Sloan Management Review. And I've tried to do that before, and I think that's really a nice thing to show that when there are practical implications, like in our case, this is how you can do reconnections well and avoid reconnection disasters. So creating that companion piece that goes along with the academic scholarly piece, I think is a nice combination. It was also something that after both got published, I sent around to a bunch of people, probably many of the SNS members, saying like, "Oh, people who I thought might teach networks, I thought, oh, this might be interesting to you for your students. So here's the short little practical one, but then also if you're interested in the theory and the whatever, here's the I mean, people didn't write back and say, stop bothering me. Maybe it was implied, but many of them said, oh, this is really great. I'm actually teaching a course in negotiations to executives this afternoon. I'm going to use this I'm going to use this today because it's a nice little takeaway. So I think that's a nice way when we can do it as academics. That's a nice thing.
Yeah, that's great. That's making real impact. I'm actually teaching a network session next semester. I'm gonna check that out and use it. Because my students also get very nervous about reconnecting, and sometimes even more so than reaching out to new contacts. So that's a real challenge. Yeah, appreciate.
I think so. Some of my own research in the last couple of years has been on connection anxieties and networking anxieties, networking motivation, getting over that hump. Because it does seem that people don't all love networking. There's an aversion to it, and like figuring out what that's about, helping people overcome that, I think is interesting and also potentially practical. So it's good that you're helping your students with that.
Thank you.
That's all the questions we had for you today. Thank you so much for your candor. We're really honored that you were the first guest of our podcast, and we know that everything you shared with us today will be very helpful to the entire SNS community. So thank you.
And I was so excited. Oh.
No, I was going to say our pleasure.
and was so excited to see where your journey takes you next. And really, really look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. It was great to speak about the journey of the paper, and it was also a good opportunity for Daniela and myself to reconstruct all the steps that we took in order to publish this article.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks to both of you for organizing this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. We had a lot of fun talking to Danielle and Emanuela about their recently published paper with Alfredo De Massis, a professor at Lancaster University Management School.
We hope you enjoyed the behind the scenes of this paper. Stay tuned for more episodes coming out soon.